Communicating audit results and exit interviews. We need to communicate the audit results to management according to the audit charter that we put in place. This is done by creating an audit report. The audit report follows a defined format. This is a standard format used by auditors and, in fact, in many places around the world. In the audit, we will put then, of course, the various scope, objective of the audit, as well as then the techniques used in performing the audit. We will then indicate any material findings. What did we actually find in that actual audit that should be brought to the attention of management? Once we have prepared the draft audit report, we'll conduct an exit interview. We'll talk to the managers of the area in which the audit was performed. This gives those managers a chance to correct any problems or miscommunications that maybe were in the audit report or where assumptions were made incorrectly. It also allows the managers then to respond to any type of recommendations the auditor has made in how to address any material findings. The results of that exit interview and the response from management will then be included in the final report to be presented according to the audit charter to then senior management or the audit committee of the board of directors. We communicate audit as per then the conditions of the audit charter. We must make sure that an audit is only communicated to those people who should have access to it. It quite often contains sensitive information that we may not want to be publicly disclosed. In conducting the exit interview, we discuss with managers, especially from the local areas, the various findings and recommendations we have. It is important that there is a separation, though, between a finding. A finding is something which is discovered through the audit examination, and a recommendation. The recommendation should be separate from the finding, so we know that the recommendation is then based on the auditor's judgment. What the auditor recommends should be done as a result of that finding. The recommendation does not change the finding. However, in some cases, maybe the recommendation given by the auditor was incomplete or maybe not quite precise. And if it was such that the recommendation was mixed with a finding, that would then bring into question the finding itself. Therefore, these are separate sections within the actual audit report. Once we've conducted this with management, their response and any things that needed to be corrected in the draft audit can be then fixed before this becomes a final report. In some cases, management will agree with the recommendations and say that we will promise to fix that problem within a certain period of time. That will then be indicated in the final audit report that management agrees with its recommendation and the time period then to address it. In another case, a manager may dispute that recommendation and say that they do not agree. That also will then be indicated in the audit report, and that can go to senior management to arbitrate whether or not the finding of the auditor should actually then be followed up with that recommendation, or whether or not they choose to side with management's opinion that that recommendation is not appropriate. So during the exit interview, we've ensured that the facts then in our report are correct. We ensure the recommendations we make are realistic and cost-effective, that certainly we cannot put in a recommendation that would require an unnecessary expense on behalf of the company to mitigate a non-material issue. We also then, of course, will indicate the corrective action to be taken, as well as then the dates for remediation that management has agreed to. If management disagrees on the findings, quite often it is important that we elaborate on the significance. Why is that finding important? Why is that something that management should at least be aware of and know the implications of that finding? In other words, what would be the risk to the organization if they did not address that finding? And of course, not therefore correct that control weakness. We should, of course, indicate, in many cases through examples, what the potential impact of an incident related to that finding could be, whether or not that's measured in quantitative, such as money, or qualitative, such as reputational areas. We then present the audit. The audit is made up of two distinct parts: an executive summary, which is the high-level overview or summary of the audit itself, usually a fairly short document of a page or two. It indicates what was done in the audit, the findings, the recommendations, and the response from management. That would then be followed up by a more detailed audit report that would go to local management to enable them to take action upon the actual findings and recommendation. It is important that an executive summary is fairly short and easy to read. We should make sure it's written in a language that senior management can understand and certainly will spur them to take action rather than just confuse them. We should ensure, especially with an IT audit, that we still write then the audit to be from a business perspective. We can say here it's important that since management looks at things, how would it affect the business, that even when we've conducted an IT audit, the results of the audit should be put forward from that business perspective so they understand how a weakness with an IT system would not just affect that IT system, but would affect then the business units and operations that depend on that system. Quite often it can be helpful to provide some type of visual presentation, something through the use of tables or charts that can be used to make this more understandable to management, so they can understand what the areas then of importance are without having to read a lot of text. The audit itself becomes a legally discoverable document that will be provided to senior management. One of the risks we always have when we perform an audit is where there may be an attempt, especially by middle management, to constrain an audit, to make sure that information isn't passed to senior management that could make their department or their operation look bad. There should be no attempt by lower management to restrict the access of then that audit report to senior management. Quite often, when an issue has been identified and fixed in an audit, we'll find that the managers involved will say, well, since we've fixed that, we don't need to put that in the audit, right? Well, it should still go in the audit because it was a finding, because it was something that was wrong, that was identified. But it's indicated that management has taken action already to fix that. This is important for several reasons. Number one, to prove that we actually did check that area and anything that was found was addressed. Because what happens if that problem reemerges a few months later? And then we can go back and say, well, there's nothing in the audit about this. And the auditor can claim that, well, we addressed that, but there's no evidence of it. So it's important then that everything in the audit should then be indicated that is of material or significant, should we say, impact. One of the problems we quite often will have to put into an audit are any limitations on the audit. This unfortunately happens fairly frequently, where management may have not granted the auditor access to information or access to a certain area that should have been examined in that audit. And despite the attempts by the auditor to gain that information, that was then restricted or not made available to the auditor. That will then be identified as a limitation in the audit. So when the audit goes to senior management and the board of directors, they're aware that there were attempts or a reluctance by then managers at other levels to restrict the capability of that audit to be then thorough and complete. Now, the important thing is that the audit provides recommendations. The auditor themselves is expected to provide recommendations on what to do about problems that have been identified in the audit. We have a finding, we should provide a recommendation. In other words, don't just bring out the problem, but also provide a suggestion of a potential solution. It is up to management to accept or reject that recommendation. But it is important for an auditor to provide that recommendation as an objective, independent third party. However, the auditor does not become a consultant. The auditor is not the person who should then implement that change or should not provide any types of services beyond the audit to try to ensure that their recommendation then is followed through.